Hi, everybody. This is the bi-weekly meeting in the North America time zone for the Kubernetes IoT and Edge Working Group. As a reminder, this meeting is public and recorded. In the end, these recordings will be posted to YouTube. So if you're not prepared to have that happen, drop off now. We've got a working notes and agenda document. I've posted a link to it in the chat. Right now, I only see one item nominated on the agenda, but sometimes we end up discussing other things. That item was put there by James Kirkland. I'm not sure if I see him as attending yet either.
Yeah, I don't see him either.
So maybe we'll, that item was discussion of bootstrapping Kubernetes on the edge. We'll give him a few minutes to see if he materializes. Otherwise, I guess we could chat a little bit about the topic anyway in his absence, and maybe he can catch the result on the recording. Jan, you have anything to add?
Nothing much. Yeah, I pinged just James privately to see if he'll join. So let's give a couple of minutes on that. I have a couple of links that popped up on my radar on the similar topics this week. So we can talk about this anyways and see how it goes.
Hi, I see another co-lead, Preston, just joined. So the other thing I guess we should discuss is preparation for our intro and deep dive sessions at KubeCon. It's, what is it? I guess it's about a month away, maybe a month and an extra week. But we're planning to put on a survey of the unique protocols and networking that go on in edge and IoT scenarios. Something that many of these go a little beyond classic HTTPS and TCP that you see in normal cloud data centers. But if anybody wants to jump in during this call to nominate or suggest things to be covered or ways to cover it for those presentations, I'd be all ears. Or if anybody wants to help put together decks.
I think I can volunteer on the MQTT side, just given the volume of involvement from the Eclipse Foundation around MQTT stuff. I've got one of the co-inventors of the protocol and would be happy to help me craft the presentation. So I think that's probably something I can contribute.
Yeah, great. Because what I'd like to do, there are an awful lot of tools. Some of them specifically call out or implement abilities to work directly with Kubernetes. Others are containerized so that they should fit into a Kubernetes scenario without too much effort, but others kind of, in terms of their documentation, are more indeterminate. I think MQTT has a number of tools I've encountered, and didn't we give a demo of one of them at KubeCon Barcelona?
What I think also would be interested is to present some of the techniques that could be used to provide a useful tooling for other protocols, like Kilton, as you guys have in IOFOG, the stack for the Bluetooth and how you call it, hardware abstraction layer.
Hardware abstraction layer. Yeah. Cool.
So, yeah, I was thinking maybe in the intro we'd go into a list of protocols, putting them in categories and explain what they are and what they're good for, just in case somebody has an Edge IoT app where they're in search of a communication method. And then in the deep dive portion, we can go into what tooling is available to actually deploy them, manage them, get observability, run them at scale in a practical sense.
I like the structure, Steve. I think it would be a lot of value for the community then to get a survey of protocols, which would help tie up something that is a question on a lot of people's minds as they enter the Edge environment is, what on earth am I looking at and how do I bring it all into a big picture? So cool.
Okay. And I think I put a list of it. I tried to in the abstract for these talks, but one of the things I ran into very quickly, there's a 900 character limit on that. And as it turns out, I believe there's in excess of 50 of these protocols, especially if you go into commonly used industry specific ones that, you know, in many cases, perhaps don't have a software defined solution, but would require some sort of a hardware gateway device. But nonetheless, I think there still is an opportunity to invoke Kubernetes and service mesh into a scenario where you'd manage a control plane over them, even if you're not running the actual protocol itself in software managed by Kubernetes.
Hey, Steve. This is Dan Kahn from CNCF. I wanted to just briefly introduce myself to the group. I also can help if you run into issues on the KubeCon preparations. But on the landscape question and sort of talking through them, I think a lot of folks may be familiar with the CNCF Cloudnative landscape. I just pasted a tweet into the chat window. Folks may not be familiar, though, that the Linux Foundation, the Cloudnative Computing Foundation, has a sister organization in the Linux Foundation called LF Edge, and they are working on a landscape that is very much in flux. I would just basically say that they've barely begun right now. And so there's no requirement to do so, but if some folks in this group were interested in working with this other landscape to try and list in those several dozen projects, and of course what tends to be most tricky is categorizing them.
Yeah.
I think it should be very to basically just take like pull requests of additional projects.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I think to some extent for some of our prior KubeCon presentations, we've put together a little bit of that sort of material of classification in categories other than network communications. But yeah, if we're going to go to the work, it might as well be documented and put in a place where people can easily find it later.
Yeah.
Well, and what is nice then is that there's both a lot of marketing in this document, but it's also an interactive landscape. So you can go in and sort by location or by funding or pull by stars and most recent commit, and it's kind of a good way of keeping track of a lot of technologies or projects or such without necessarily making value judgments about them.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to take you up on that suggestion then. That sounds like a great idea.
Okay. So there's a link at the very top on opening a pull request.
Okay.
And please feel free to reach out to me or on the pull request if you run into questions or issues about how to interact with it.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the things we are going to talk about or already have are over there in that niche of the Linux Foundation already. It seems like in the category of IoT and Edge, it's fragmented across a number of foundations. We've got representatives on this Zoom today from the Eclipse Foundation, so there are a lot of very significant things that live over there as well in the CNCF and other niches and branches of the Linux Foundation tree.
Well, definitely. Eclipse is separate from us, but I will just point out that the landscape itself doesn't care. It just, you have to put the organization that each project belongs to, although it can be a nonprofit or even its own project. But we already have projects on here from Open19 and OpenStack and CNCF and the Open Compute project.
Yeah, it's been on my list for a while to do something about that for the projects we're doing already at Eclipse. So I'll follow up as well with Steve on this. So thanks, Dan.
Great, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Great idea. So I see James Kirkland has joined now, and he's got a line item on the agenda for discussing bootstrapping Kubernetes on the edge. James, I should have thought of this at the beginning, but maybe we should go through an intro round for any newcomers on this call to introduce themselves. And James, I don't know if this is your first time or not, but if you were on in the past, I don't recollect it. So maybe you can go first with a little introduction. And James, if you're there, you're still muted. Okay, while we wait for James, are there any other first timers on this call who'd like to spend 30 seconds or 60 seconds introducing themselves?
Yeah,
I just did it
Oh,
second ago. Sorry. It's Dan Kahn from CNCF.
Yeah.
And I would mention that CNCF also runs a telecom user group, which we now have Verizon and Vodafone and AT&T and Rakuten and a number of others who are watching this work as well and looking for engagement and overlap. I'm looking at particularly scenarios of supporting hundreds or thousands of base stations. I remain really interested in trying to understand the status of Kubernetes Federation v2 KubeFed, and we will be kind of looking forward to publicizing work that this group creates or highlights.
Okay, is that telco thing under CNCF or under Kubernetes?
It's under CNCF, but it is totally public, and anyone's welcome to participate. Let me just paste in the link for it here, and I'll put it in the notes as well.
And is that principally for users or vendors as well?
It's definitely, we made an exception here where CNCF has an end user community of about 120 top companies, and that one is a vendor free zone. But because the telco world works differently and a lot of the intelligence tends to be with the vendors, we carved out this as a separate exception. So it's intentionally allowed for both operators and vendors to collaborate together.
Okay, great, thanks. Any other introductions?
Yeah, I'll go. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
cool. So my name is Jeff Young. I work for a startup called Industrial IO. We're here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And basically what we do is we go to older industrial sites and integrate with their existing processes for either ethanol manufacturing, or we'll tap into their power management, pull in their data to our data lake, and compare what they're doing to utility bills and help them save money. And one of the challenges we've had is we run sort of extractors against these historians that are on site, but we don't really have a good way to manage them. So we're looking at things like IO Fog, Cube Edge.
So in other words, as part of your service, you need to land some kind of an application workload, maybe even some hardware out at these edge locations?
Yeah, it depends on the customer, not always hardware. Surprisingly enough, a lot of these companies have virtual environments, so we really can just get a VM from them. So.
Have you reached the point where rather than using VM technology, you're asking if these people are running Kubernetes so that you could deliver a containerized app to run as well?
So most customers are just like VMware or something like that. They don't know, they're not quite up to speed on containers. So the best we can do is get like a Linux VM and then install Docker on it ourselves.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. So.
Anybody else want to introduce themselves?
Hey everyone, my name is Jeff Beck. I am first time on the call here, but been kind of watching the work you guys have been doing. I am a technical product marketing manager at Red Hat, and specifically I work in the runtimes unit. But before joining Red Hat, I was actually a sales engineer for ThingWorx, if you guys are familiar with the IoT platform. ThingWorx, bought by PTC. And before that, I had a couple of startups in the IoT space in smart buildings and energy management. So I've got a kind of vested interest historically in IoT, and I'm really interested in Kubernetes running at the edge. And then even more specifically, Red Hat is supporting a new product, a new version of Java that's able to be compiled down to native code. So I'm really interested in the combination of Kubernetes or Java running in containers on Kubernetes at the edge for pre-processing, all those kind of things. So just excited to join and kind of listen in. And I will be at KubeCon as well in a couple of weeks too. So if you guys need any help there, I can sign up for some stuff as well.
Okay, definitely introduce yourself because a number of us are going to be there. Yeah, I've heard of ThingWorks and this Java thing you mentioned. So by native code, you mean it doesn't require a JRE at all. It ends up being effectively binary executable by the time the process is over?
Yes.
Maybe we
I
lost.
think so, yeah. So let me post your link here. So that's something I think I want to cover a little bit in the other session we had. So not the working group one, but other related to developing the microservices. But yeah, this is like a Java framework specific, aimed specifically to create a cloud native.
Okay.
Think of it like the footprint of a C application compiled down native code. So,
yeah, if you wouldn't mind, if you could put, I'm interested in that. If you could put a link to it in our Slack channel, that'd be great.
Will do.
Anybody else got an introduction before we maybe move on to James?
Hello, everybody. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Berat from Sorbonne University, France. So this is my first time in these meetings. So we are working on a project called EdgeNet, which is a joint project between the US and France and Canada. So we are partners of US Ignite. So we try to create an edge cluster by using Kubernetes. And now we are working on a feature called selective deployment. So I want to learn the current state of edge compatibility of Kubernetes. So because of that, I would like to participate in your studies and works.
Great, welcome.
Okay, thanks. So James, are you there now? I guess we'll assume that he either has audio issues or he joined initially and got interrupted and walked away from the call. But we could maybe
we could talk about the Java thing, because actually I had a question. I had trouble with my microphone, which was the how does this Java compiled down to native machine binary differ from some of the micro JVMs that are in things like smart card technology, or there's some trusted execution zones on even very small ARM controllers that run trusted kind of Java applets on a special sort of enclave in an execution part of the architecture in some of those ARM chips. Like how do you contrast those, I guess?
You know, this is Jeff Beck. I don't know the things you're speaking of, so I can only kind of speak to the Quarkus stuff, but it utilizes Growl VM, which is a project, open source project, mostly supported, I think it came out of the Oracle group. And so more specifically, it uses a component called Substrate. And I think Substrate is kind of the catalyst that allows it to compile the Java libraries down to native code. If you look at that Quarkus.io link in the chat, it kind of gives you really if you scroll down a little bit, the visual that it has is really kind of shows you the memory footprint and the processing or the boot up time, where we're seeing extreme amount of interest. First and foremost, kind of like the no-brainer use case is really for serverless. So if you've got applications that you run periodically. You want to.
Yep. No, I was just going to say that's one of the biggest issues, and we're struggling with serverless in a product we have called Cloud Run. Is the cold start time for Java is painful.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me level set a little bit. So this Quarkus project is relatively new. It is incredibly growing by incredible leaps and bounds. Version 1.0 will be released in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So from a product support from a Red Hat perspective, we won't be supporting this officially enterprise support until later in 2020. So
is Quarkus open source?
Quarkus is open source, yes. Obviously, Red Hat's heavily invested in it, but obviously it is an open source community, and I think you can see all the participants there. The big thing is it has the ability to create extensions for different specifications and other technologies. So what you're seeing is a lot of service provider or software vendors creating their own extensions. So,
have people encountered any licensing issues? It strikes me that if you utilize Java libraries, pull them in, and I don't know if you'd call whatever this does compiling, but let's say for sake of discussion, you compile them. Are there vendors of these libraries that would be looking to get money out of you for doing that?
I think
it's a great question. I don't
the
know.
same as if you would use those libraries in your project anyways. So yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah, I agree. If they're
don't think
GPL
it changes.
v3, right? Like if they're GPL v3, that applies to a Java bytecode on a JVM just the same way. So, I mean, essentially, it's just taking some intermediate bytecode representation and then native compiling that. Hasn't that been around in some form for Java as far as aren't there bytecode compilers? I'm not a Java person, I'll be totally honest, but I mean, assuming that like the same way py.exe can take Python bytecode and compile it into native, architecture specific binary. I mean, this becomes architecture specific, I assume, right? Quarkus code becomes ARM specific if prepared for an ARM execution environment.
That's a great question. Yes, it has to, right? In the end, I'm almost positive. So I'm not sure if it's gotten to the point where the maturity where it can be deployed on ARM yet. I'll have to look and see in the details of that. Not an expert, so I don't want to overspeak on that. So I'll kind of let the website speak for itself at this point.
And you're right, Preston. I recollect things in the earliest days of Java, say a year or two after it came out of Sun. I believe there was one for HP that was earmarked for embedded systems. They never seemed, to my knowledge, to get much market traction, but they've been out there a long time.
I think what you're seeing that may be different now is the other catalysts in terms of microservices and serverless and those kind of things are maybe a more conducive environment. And, and I'm not sure what this means for IoT and the edge, but I just keep thinking about the potential of how many Java developers there are out there and the ability to do compilation out of native that might, once again, the pre-processing sounds really interesting, and pushing intelligence further to the edge seems like an interesting marriage potentially.
It seems like a good call for some of the cloud native technologies that come with Kubernetes too, in the sense of needing to have some infrastructure to manage it and process updates, because dragging in this myriad of potential Java libraries sounds like you could have a CVE per week and need to have some solution that really enables you to do updates pretty easily at scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bigger challenge for this project is going to be the edge cases, right? Like, so we have a project at Google called gvisor that is, like user space kernel stuff, and occasionally you'll hit random little like unimplemented syscalls, right? Like, and it's pretty good. Like, I think that surface is very, very well understood, that Linux kernel surface. And so gvisors actually works quite well for what it tries to do. But when you start to cover every kind of oddball edge surface that people have come to depend upon in the JVM, how many programs will run into portability issues where they've relied on something that isn't in this new tool chain essentially. But I'm just saying that's, in my estimation, that's going to be where there'll probably be some speed bumps along the way. They're all workable. But
I think this is more suited to the like a greenfield development, and it's not just providing the compilation to the native code, as you said, that was here for a long time, but also providing kind of a framework to to use all the new libraries and services you would expect to do a proper containerization, to provide all the things like observability and things like that you would expect from the like a cloud native microservice. So it's a more like a bigger picture framework for developing microservices with Java that will be both like a more resource efficient than running it on a traditional JRE, but provide to a developer more tools to do the things properly. So provide a health checks, provide all the things that you would expect from such a service.
Do you know if it supports? Is it source specific, or will it support like Kotlin? Does it come in the middle of the Java compilation process, or does it only work from source?
I'm not really
I know.
sure.
I know. Not everyone's gonna know.
Yeah.
I always come in with lots of questions. But.
No, that's great. But I mean, if it's an interesting topic, we can definitely find someone to talk more about and answer all these questions on one of the following calls. If that's, I know it's not strictly Kubernetes topic, but as we all agree here, it everything that brings containerization and closer to the devices, it's a valid topic. So if you guys want, we can schedule something for next.
Yeah, another one that's kind of in the adjacent space topologically is the whole WASM WASI stuff. Being able to write WebAssembly that is then compiled into a portable binary format, and then the WebAssembly system interface that Mozilla is starting to work on is pretty interesting from that idea, because even today, because this would be architecture specific, one of the things that gives you complexity in a CI tool chain is that you're going to end up with container manifests with multiple architecture specific containers. Whereas the WASM stuff allows you potentially to have truly portable binaries. Anyway, they're all in this space of like, what are some interesting language developments for constrained operating environments?
Do you have a link to what you call it?
Well, it sounds like, for this, the next KubeCon, we're giving a survey of networking related, but maybe since the proposals are going to be due for KubeCon Europe fairly soon, I think they're due in mid-November, maybe we can queue up this subject as our topic for coverage for KubeCon Europe in the spring.
Yeah, definitely. So with the other session I have at the KubeCon North America, I wanted to scratch this topic about, particularly how the developing services for the edge and constrained environment differs from the, the cloud one. But as I said, only scratching it for now. Maybe we can deep dive it later on. I think it's an important topic.
Well, anyway, thanks for bringing this up. That's an interesting discussion, and maybe we can queue up Quarkus for a future meeting as well if we can get a speaker on it. James, I'm going to give you one last call if you're there. I still see you on the participants list. Okay, we'll assume that he's not there, but does anybody want? He nominated a discussion on bootstrapping Kubernetes at the edge. So I gather that means taking it from bare metal or a VM and bringing up Kubernetes and maintaining it. And it strikes me as the realm that a number of distributions address, but maybe there's more to it than that. Anybody got any ideas, or they want to?
I do actually. I'd started taping out, and I never finished writing, but I can quickly describe what I think would be an interesting piece of this puzzle, which is that when you use something like kubeadmin, right? Let's just kind of assume kubeadmin might be somehow in the mix in terms of provisioning the initial cluster. You need to seed the configuration of each node to kind of, you need to pick one thing, even if you install it with every machine having an identical image, you still need to pick one of them to start as the API master and then have the others join. And sort of this, there's sort of this quick, you know, how do you pick the thing that's going to be the thing that starts all the other things, right? And so there's
before that, even installing those OSs is another thing. And then
well, sure, yeah, but I'm just saying, okay, you can get a cloned image on a bunch of things, or you have a USB installer, whatever it is. So, but to me, one of the interesting hard parts on the bootstrapping is now how do you get this cluster started? And most of the kubeadmin sort of administrative guides talk about, like, you know, start this one and then get the token and then put the token on the other one so that they have the way of joining that master, right? So there's a protocol, a leadership election protocol called the Bully protocol. Here, I can ping in some links as I go here really quick. So the Bully protocol is like a very lightweight leadership election protocol. And there's a Golang library I'd found that does this over multicast UDP. So the idea would be that you'd have all these machines sort of turn on and use something honestly pretty arbitrary. It could be the lowest IP address, it could be the lowest, you know, boot time, timestamp, but something where they all multicast out, broadcast out their start time, and you have the corresponding listener that listens for everyone doing this, and they all agree to pick the one with the lowest whatever.
Okay, so a leader election essentially.
Leader election, but over broadcast, you know, like multicast UDP.
Got it.
So that way you could basically you'd have these identically imaged machines, and you just simply plug them all in and power them all on, and they form a coherent cluster automatically.
Okay, yeah, I could see how that would work. I mean, you could use MAC addresses if they're on the same physical net, or IP addresses. That would be something that comes to mind is lowest one wins or something, and it's repeatable.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on, you know, a kubeadm, I believe, would boot up from pre-installed Linux on every node, but it begs the question of how you get Linux there in the first place too. Another way of getting a node that maybe elevates you from a bare Linux kind of command line starting point, what do you think of the prospects of Kind being viable as an edge-based Kubernetes, or maybe even a tool to bootstrap it up? Kind, for those who don't know, it's an attempt to run Kubernetes pseudo nodes within a single Docker runtime.
But those would be running on a single one of these machines? Or?
I think Kind would typically be bootstrapped as one node running Linux. Then you have to install a Docker container runtime. Then Kind will bring up a Kubernetes cluster. A cluster could be a cluster of one, but I believe it's capable of joining in worker nodes that are on external machines. I've certainly heard people talk about it being a potential edge solution, but I don't know that, you know, they've turned more into discussion / arguments as to whether that's production worthy.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems a little, yeah, it does seem like a bit of a bootloader like idea. It maybe feels a little elaborate for just the bootloader step, because I think Kind can do a lot more, right? It's designed to be more of the, but capable at least of being the stateful running thing.
I
rather
think a
than just
lot of
startup.
people gravitated towards it. The principal use case that I think got attraction was developers wanting the fastest, easiest possible way to bring up a Kubernetes cluster to do some testing on their laptop kind of scenario. So that if you're working with anything with a Docker runtime, which could even be a Mac or Windows, you can quickly get a Kubernetes cluster. Now, how accurate and production worthy that Kubernetes cluster is another matter. But even if it is not really production worthy, you could use it as a bootstrapping tool to get yourself to a shall we say, a better Kubernetes cluster and rapidly advance up the food chain to where you're running with Kubernetes rather than dealing with lower level components.
Dayan, did you know anything about what James was going to talk about? Are you familiar with that work at all?
No, not that much. We chatted a little bit last week, and he said he was doing some research on the topic, and it'd be good to share, but yeah.
Yeah, and I just pinged him on Slack with no response, so I think
that, we can postpone that for the next one. One also interesting thing that caught my eye this week is the Firecube from vWorks this week, which is kind of in a similar.
I'm not familiar with that. Can you fill me in?
So I sent the link to the chat. It's also an easy way using like a GitOps approach to get the cluster running everywhere where basically there's a KVM or some kind of a VM.
Yeah,
it's an
using
alternative
Git
to kind
of along the lines of what we got demoed by Chick-fil-A at KubeCon North America in Seattle last year, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it says, I just followed your link, and it says it can be seen as an alternative to kind. Now, of course, I suppose pulling everything from Git at an edge location presumes that you have access to a Git repository as part of your bootstrapping process. So I think actually in reality that kind would probably presume that you have access to a Docker registry. I know there must be edge scenarios where neither of those or getting access to either of those might be somewhat problematic. You know, if you had to run a local registry, then that's another bootstrapping process of getting that on the air too.
Yeah, this mentions it pulls everything from Git, so it'd be interesting to know if Firecube can essentially serialize everything offline into kind of a single a single package, or if it requires a degree of dynamic bootstrapping. You know, it is interesting. You know, it's sort of like nested dolls of isolation, which this idea that things you may just end up running all of Kubernetes in a container as a mode of isolating, especially if you're running it in something like a VM or gvisor or something for true isolation. Cool. The other one we should invite. I've met with them a couple times, but there's sort of this realm of all of the Docker centric or a Kubernetes centric, essentially OS distributions. So K3 OS and Talos are two that I'm aware of. I don't know if anyone knows of others, but
well, CoreOS, I guess, is that still with us or not? I'm not even
sure. I don't know if CoreOS is still really a thing as a and I guess you could say there's sort of some snappy like distributions, but even with those, I think they were still much more than the kernel, whereas I think K3 OS and Talos are basically almost nothing but the kernel and Kubernetes. And so they're really sort of hyper minimalized OSs, which are basically just enough to launch Kubernetes. And then Kubernetes becomes kind of everything, which I think is a pretty interesting category for the edge, right? And from security, you don't really want to have anything else in your surface that you have to manage or patch or worry about.
Right.
You don't have to.
Well, I agree. I think that would be an interesting future Zoom meeting if we can get speakers. And I'd like them to not only talk about their architecture, but even also their availability for different processor architectures, not just x86, but ARM and maybe things other than ARM as well, because that, by the time you're looking for minimal and edge, that certainly comes into play.
One thing I can say here, I know Fedora has Fedora Core OS, which I believe OKD4 will be based on, but it can be standalone. And Fedora also has Fedora IoT. It's a minimal OS. I'll paste links here. I haven't looked in detail on what these things are, but I know they exist.
So one more thing in this space that caught my attention this week is the FIDO protocol. I don't know if anybody looked
Is
into
that
that.
the Amazon protocol or is that something else?
That's a two-factor, right?
Yeah, and it's a way to basically generate a secret on the. It's a part of the provisioning process, right?
Yeah. So I actually did some prototyping with this, and there are pretty good Python libraries for it. And one of the things that is imperfect about it, so I was actually trying to use a USB FIDO key as a provisioning key for devices where the key itself is actually a single factor. So it's for a headless device that has no input device. And so you would use the key as a sole factor of authentication, not a second factor. One of the things that's okay but not great about it is that the keys are associated with a user, and the way the key challenge is verified is without any key ID. So you basically try all of the keys attached to that user and see if any of them match the one that's plugged in, basically. And so that's limited to 10. I think 10 or 20 per user, something like that, because it's scaled on the idea that it's attached to a person, one of these FIDO keys is. But I did get it working. So the idea was that I was using it to actually refresh a time expiring temporary key on a device. So the key had a 24-hour expiration. And then what would happen is somebody would need to plug in the FIDO key and it would refresh the token based on that challenge. And the idea I had in the kind of use case scenario was that this FIDO key is kept in a factory environment. There's very common in sort of these industrial environments to have a locked key box, right? It's the box on the wall somewhere in the factory that only the foreman has a key to. And inside that box are all the keys to important things, right? And so the idea would be that as part of a shift change or something, from the IoT security point of view, would basically verify that a person of authority who has limited physical access to a special key box got this FIDO key and inserted it physically on-prem in the machine that you want to make sure is still trustworthy, so that somebody didn't, take it out of the factory and is still sending you data from it somewhere else. So I got that all working nominally, but it felt a little bit like I was forcing the FIDO key into a job that it wasn't intended to, because it wasn't really attached to a user, it was attached to a company. But the FIDO design really was around attaching it to a user specifically.
Okay, but the idea was you'd periodically establish authentication or validity as part of your workflow, and then
right.
Would
you basically say that we need to
steps like firmware updates. You might want to do that as well.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, the idea is to sort of basically reprove physical possession and attestation with a known hardware cryptographic proof point, right? That is under a separate
And the risks
security
you
maintenance
protect it
process.
against by keeping it in the locked box during normal conditions are
I mean, the
that,
idea is that somebody with a device that's got like a hardware secure element in the device can still steal that device
right,
and install it somewhere else, and nothing about the system can really tell. I mean, you can get into like origin IP addresses or whatever, but for the most part, like the idea is to make sure that it's still under the control of
right.
the
And I
people on the
suppose
premises.
there's this anecdotal story that a San Francisco bus had an IoT device stolen off the bus while moving. I don't personally know if it's true or not, but if you would require reauthentication when they came back to the bus barn at night, that might prove that the box didn't disappear. And you might not catch it within the first few hours, but you could catch it within a day. So there could be some value there. I could see that.
This is also saying to me that you can replace kind of like the user login portion of an authentication, session with this, right?
Right, that's what I meant by single factor, right? So instead
Yeah.
of it being in addition to the login for a device that has no input devices, it can be the login.
Yeah, this is cool because I see user association is a big challenge with machines that don't have a keyboard and mouse and so on. And this would be a great way to say, here's your user, you're authorized, it'll work for the 8 hours we're on shift. That's pretty cool.
Now remember, you can't easily just from the key say who it is, right? It's like just a password.
Right. But it's
so
like
you
it
still
could
have
be
to
passed.
loop through users. You still have to kind of do this sort of inefficient iteration, but it's again for a finite, reasonably
for a
finite
rare
set of
thing.
hundreds. It's not a big deal.
I
Yeah.
once worked at a place that used something like this for the software signing key for the software we published. So in this case, it required a key that was kept literally in a safe. But the idea is we didn't want it tied to a specific individual. What if the person leaves the company? We couldn't get our next release out, but it served its purpose well. And the reason it was kept in the safe was concerned that hackers, if we left it permanently plugged into a system and hackers took over that system, they could conceivably put out software in our name. So there was perceived to be a little security gain by keeping that thing separated.
I mean, even when people are using HSMs and signing keys and derived signing keys and HSM appliances, there's still usually something on a piece of paper in a safe somewhere behind at the root of it all.
But from little that I read on FIDO is that it's a pluggable out, so you can basically use it with any other kind of biometrics if supported. So for more advanced use cases, it can be I don't know, fingerprint or voice recognition or something like that. Yeah, that will generate the same secret.
And the latest revision of the spec, which I'm not as familiar with, really more tightly integrated into the browser and into the browser hardware, so that it's becoming a standard called the web auth flow, but that's somewhat coupled to web specifics, which I again, I haven't dug into this newer version, but it seemed like it made it less compatible for devices somewhat, because it was kind of making assumptions about web sessions and web UIs, user agents, that kind of stuff. But I still think the primitives were basically the same thing.
Yeah. The interesting aspect here too is how it fits into scenarios where you might be running virtualization. I've got personal experience with using, I think it is a FIDO key just as part of my two-factor authentication for GitHub and certain other things. And with the hypervisor I'm using, it certainly is capable of a scenario where you plug it into the hypervisor host, but go through an added step of choosing which of the VMs it gets mapped to.
I was looking to see
One
if I have
little
that in
question.
reach.
The idea is to put it on the edge, to use the key on the edge, or somewhere on your development PC?
No, I think it's
On the
at the edge.
Oh, that is perfect. That's like such a good idea. Like,
I think, you know, at one point, as Dejan was saying, was and in the bootstrapping and provisioning process is one opportunity. And then I outlined a sort of periodic reattestation flow, and then Kilton was talking about sort of user association. I think it applies to all three of those scenarios.
yeah, I think like when you're talking about manufacturing environments, for example, that you often want to do changes on your system where you actually have to be in place to do these changes. And I think this could be like a great way to authenticate that you are actually on place or in the place before you run your updates. Because you don't want, I mean, I work with laser machines. You don't want to update your laser machine while somebody is like in there. So you have to make sure that somebody is there that is actually doing the upload job.
That makes a lot of sense. I would really like to talk, and Moritz, you're often on the evening session, well, Pacific time evening sessions, the alternative sessions of this working group meeting. Would you be interested in talking about that workflow in more depth? Because I feel like I can learn a lot from what you need to see happen in this process.
Yeah, sure.
I even wonder what might be available in FIDO keys that are industrialized. You know, that I certainly have the consumer grade one, but for a lot of these edge locations, I think people are typically looking for the one that could go hundreds of feet underwater and be exposed to fiery temperatures and still survive.
Now, I mean, this is being recorded, so I can't say too much, but Google's come out with their own flavor of this called the Titan FIDO key, because we'd worked with Yubico on developing that FIDO standard. So Google employees have always had that as a requirement on all our laptops, et cetera. But the Google flavored version of it uses our Titan chip, and that was something in part we did just because that way we could control the full supply chain, even at the fab. So we would know the full provenance of that chip.
And is that Titan implementation, say, hardened? I don't know. You call it, if you were advertising it, could you label it mil spec or something like that?
I don't know. As far as certifications go, I mean, it's certainly something that is stood by. But I mean, it's all crypto is all about layers, right? So at the end of the day, it's a random number generator somewhere in hardware. Right, and then you have crypto primitives on that, and then you have the FIDO protocol on that, and the FIDO thing is really about a flow that's around chat, like a challenge and response type flow based on standard crypto primitives. But it's still this sort of idea that you, as a user, I register these keys for use, and then the key and the app will do this little dialogue flow, a little bit like OAuth, but it's FIDO. Anyway, so that's just another piece of hardware. I think Yubico and Google are the only two real fabricators of these two-factor keys. Yubico is definitely, they make the Nano and all the others. And they're also now, they support that protocol over Bluetooth and near field. So you can use it with mobile phones that don't have a USB stick, but that's another place you could use it with devices, is as a Bluetooth key. You could have a machine, for example, like shut down if it doesn't properly do this challenge flow every hour or something like that. It does require a centralized service though, right? I don't know, and centralized is relative, but you can't do this purely on a totally isolated edge, because the public keys that you're associating with the user or associating with some entity are stored in a service that the app needs to call and check, is this key valid, right? Whether that service runs on-prem or in the cloud or whatever, it can't be solely in device, basically.
Okay, I got it. There were some kind of hardware devices used as keys that the semiconductor industry had a decade or more ago. I don't know if they're still out there, but I think they were used in the high grades of UL certification for door locks and access control and things. So maybe those would be viable to put into in a scenario where you had to be air gapped. I assume those things still exist. I know one of them was made by Dallas Semiconductor that I got as swag at some show, but I have no idea if that company is even still around.
Don't use the swag key to build your production system.
Made in China.
Yep, just got to be careful about the handouts.
Okay, we're nearing the top of the hour, so we've got a few minutes left. If anybody has any last minute quickies to throw onto the agenda. And as always, we'll have another meeting for the Europe and China time zones in 2 weeks. So feel free to put things on the agenda for that as well. If you have to stay up until 10 p.m. North American time to catch that, but it's open.
It's not that European friendly as well because it's 7 a.m. here, but
Well, who is it friendly to?
China, Asia.
Yeah, APAC, Australia.
APAC, yeah. Yeah, I think this was great session. Even if James wasn't able to be here today, but I think
Well, he can catch the recording. I think we certainly
absolutely
talked about it a bit.
And there's a lot of material just throwing on the pile here. So making
Yeah. So, and if we can get some
structured.
follow up on some of these suggestions, maybe some of the suggestions were mine too. But as always, if I'd love to have help in lining up even speakers on some of these specialized topics to come in and carry this. But these free-form things seem to work out okay, but I think we should maybe strive to have some more organized things at least half the time.
Hey, Steve, for an agenda of the next meeting, maybe we should put on there kind of putting a formal outline to the KubeCon North America talk. It sounds like some good stuff is emerging, but then there's, as you said, way too much material. So to fit it all in, maybe we should start to organize it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Maybe we should aspire to even having a shared Google Doc available to let people participate in that offline as well. Okay, I'll take that as an action item and get that ready for a couple weeks from now.
Perfect.
Okay, I think then we'll call this a close. It's 1 minute left, so thanks everybody for attending. This meeting's been recorded, so we'll publish that recording in a bit. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.